I'd like to talk about kind of the free speech paradox that I know that people are really exercised around on Facebook, on YouTube in particular. And there's a very sort of strong bias towards free speech absolutism, which I understand and is kind of initially quite persuasive. But I remember, especially I did a story about London Real and their sort of pivot into conspiracy thinking, and sort of wrestling with a lot of the paradoxes of that, one of which being that actually a lot of like alternative narratives and what might be a conspiracy today is actually something that we need to be part of the information ecology. It turns out that some alternative narratives around COVID, for example, are now part of the understanding of the disease. And there's this sort of paradox of, it seems likely that if the tech platforms start limiting information, they're just going to come down on the side of the status quo and then squash all alternative narratives. So that's a concern. But on the other side, there's this sense of, especially with London Real and some of these alternative narratives, they only exist in these little ecosystems where they're not being challenged. So they're not part of the general marketplace of ideas. And so I was sort of seeing this splitting off into different, what you might call backwaters or eddies of the information landscape, and they're not being challenged. And there, but there was a sort of, when I put these films out, there were a lot of people in the comments saying, you're trying to limit free speech. Free speech has to be absolute. The solution to this is just more free speech. And it didn't feel right. It feels a little bit naive, but I'm not entirely sure why it's naive. And I think you might be pointing to something with the idea that attention is finite. Do you want to unpack that?
Absolutely. Yeah, this is one of the most critical issues of our time, and we're missing the philosophical distinctions we need. It's important to realize that free speech absolutism and just the valuing of free speech was valued philosophically by the founding fathers at a time when we had an abundance of attention. We needed to make sure that people who wanted to speak wouldn't be silenced. But we never thought about, is there a finite number of ears to hear everything? Or do we have a vast overabundance of information and speech compared to the finite number of ears that we have to hear? And it was Herbert Simon in the 1970s, who's sort of a founding person in the space of, I think, both philosophy, cybernetics, and several other fields, who said that, yeah, when information becomes abundant, attention becomes finite. And the question is, how do you manage an attention economy? Tim Wu has a great paper called "Is the First Amendment Obsolete?" where the premise that the solution to bad speech is more speech depends on the idea that there was more attention than a viewer had the patience to see the counter narrative there. But if I can, in Steve Bannon's terms, flood the zone with shit, or just fill the pipe with more conspiracy theories, more questions, more suggested implications about COVID and 5G, about George Soros and Bill Gates and the IDing vaccines, and it's all a conspiracy theory. If I generate more things to look into, then there is time to explore them. That's an adversarial approach to your rule set, that we need. The solution to bad speech is more speech. And this is exactly the way that we've seen bad actors, use these platforms. When we worked back in 2016, met with Senator Mark Warner and was involved a little bit in the first social media investigations on what Russia did in the 2016 elections. And one of my colleagues, Renee DiResta, got full access to that data set. The approach there is always to try to make powerful suggestions that make people doubt the legitimacy of their institutions and what's kind of going on around them. And if I can offer more and more suggestions that link, whether it's Seth Rich and the DNC and something that happened there, or the more of these suggestions I can make, the more I can pollute the information ecology, and the more things I've created for others to do research about. So this is just not a viable approach. And then the other side of it, as you've said, is who do we trust to adjudicate what should and shouldn't be amplified or said? And so this is actually the fundamental challenge of our times, because one of the ironies here is that social media has had an accelerating effect on the delegitimization of our sense-making institutions. Do you trust or want the Trump administration deciding, what should get amplified through regulating Facebook as a national utility? Probably not. Do you trust the WHO to be the best authoritative source of information on the coronavirus when, they gave conflicting advice, as I think you've covered well in your podcast? Probably not. And do you trust also the vast number of, the populace to simply be making good sense of the situation with very little information from armchairs, not knowing anything about epidemiology? Probably not. And yet, were there pockets from a bottom-up sense of people who didn't have a background in epidemiology, but were doing their own math and research? I think the famous essay on the Hammer and the Dance, and Thomas Peo, who I think you interviewed on your podcast, he was a Silicon Valley engineer and not a medical epidemiologist, but had a background in virality. So this real question is, when we have sense making, we've kind of lost trust in the top-down big institutional authorities, whether it's the White House or the WHO. But then if you use the bottom-up decentralized mechanisms, we don't have a good way right now to sort whose voices should be amplified. But we can't not choose, because there is going to be an amplification. The second thing I want to say about this is the distinction between freedom of speech and freedom to reach, which is a distinction that Sacha Baron Cohen also added in his speech to the Anti-Defamation League last year. We all have, according to the US Constitution at least, a right to freedom of speech, but we don't have a God-given right to stadium-sized audiences of 60,000 people. That's nowhere in the Constitution. That's a thing that actually is a subtle point that Facebook's business model, the business model of the attention economy, is more successful at getting our attention when they give each of us narcissistically a bigger and bigger audience that we can reach, because then now we're more and more addicted to using those platforms. So this is actually really important to maybe diverge for a second. In the attention economy, I think some people, there's a couple articles I wrote several years ago about how the tech platforms hijack your psychological vulnerabilities to get your attention. They use, slot machine dynamics. You pull to refresh, it gives you a dopamine squirt. You pull to refresh again. They use social proof and approval, like, oh, you've got these 7 recommendations, 7 people who recommended you on LinkedIn. Don't you want to see what they recommended you for, or recommend, them for the skills that they have? These are all these kind of cute tricks of ways of getting you to come back to the site. But a very deep point in the evolution of the attention economy to get your attention was actually realizing that instead of people being paid to produce things that generate attention, like journalists who cost $100,000 a year to generate content, what if we could convince each person to be their own media channel and do that labor for free? So now suddenly, we're all the free Uber drivers of the attention economy. We're driving around attention, and we're not being paid for it. And we don't demand to be paid for it we're actually making the platforms more addictive for other people to go, because now they're seeing content from our friends. And so it's this kind of Ponzi scheme where we're all, contributing by posting things. We're contributing things that keep other people addicted to the platform. And that was a huge change and shift in how the platforms evolved. And then YouTube and Twitter are competing, or TikTok are competing on what degree of influence we are able to command of these vast audiences. In fact, there's examples of platforms like TikTok kind of tricking users into making you think that the number of likes you got was actually the number of views you got. So kind of inflating the numbers to make it feel like, oh, I'm really influencing this many thousands of people. And the more that those numbers go up, and the more it can make us feel like we're influencing bigger and bigger pools of people, the more addicted to the platforms we become. But again, none of us were granted some kind of God-given right to reach hundreds of thousands of people. And in fact, it's dangerous to reach hundreds of thousands of people if there's no ethics or no control or no notion of what is an ethical, decent, responsible way to contribute to the information environment. And like you're saying, when you have lots and lots of media channels simply just providing conspiracy theories because it's a good way of getting attention. I mean, can you imagine, a media channel bigger than the BBC in terms of reach, just spouting conspiracy theories and hatred and trying to drive up, racism in society? Well, that's essentially what, let's say, Alex Jones was. Alex Jones was recommended by YouTube 15 billion times. Alex Jones, the InfoWars conspiracy theorist. So YouTube recommended his conspiracy theories 15 billion times, which is more than the combined traffic of, the BBC, Washington Post, New York Times, Fox News combined. And if you ask yourself, like, we're granting the power of the sort of narrative exponential broadcasting powers, in Daniel Schmachtenberger's terms, but we don't provide or require any of the kind of wisdom that would go with exponential broadcasting powers, any of the media training, any of the notion of, for example, in media ethics, people learn when you're reporting on suicide or reporting on a shooting, you don't publish the photo of a shooter or the name of a shooter, because it actually inspires more shooters to do the same thing. Or you publish something on suicide, you don't publish the mechanisms of suicide, because we know that it inspires other people to commit suicide. The best data on this was with Robin Williams, I believe, when he committed suicide, that we actually saw an increase in it inspiring many more suicides very clearly. But any of those rules that have been hard-won lessons for people in journalism and media ethics, those go out the window when you suddenly have legions of, thousands and thousands of teenagers with Instagram accounts that reach 15,000 people each, and they're raking in $5,000 a month, $10,000 a month, spouting whatever it is that they want to say. This is the problem. We have totally deregulated the information environment and information ecology, where garbage wins, unfortunately. And what's so tricky about this for everyone is that while there's certain examples where this yields such amazing benefits. I mean, I would say the things I've learned from your channel and the people that are in the network and the Rebel Wisdom sort of network. And, how would I've ever discovered these people were it not for a bottom-up way where you could, reach 500,000 subscribers or whatever it is that you've got now?
Not quite, no. But there's so many issues that come up listening to you. One of which is that even combating this gets pulled into the polarization and the political spiral as well. Like I was aware of when you were talking, like you brought up the Russian involvement in the 2016 election. And I know that there's going to be quite a few comments below this video saying, oh, it's the Russia hoax. And like, I find that, so there's kind of the narrative warfare that is already going on. And I can understand where that comes from. Like I understand that the issue with, for example, the Russian narrative is that it sounds like the kind of the mainstream or the traditional media are saying the only reason that someone would be so stupid as to vote for Trump or not vote for Hillary is because they were conned by Russia, or they were conned by Cambridge Analytica, or they were conned by these people. And it puts off any of the kind of reckoning with the deeper problems with the kind of the neoliberal movement, with all of the issues with the Democratic Party in 2016, with the things that were really going on, and the deeper problems with society. And so I hear that so much. I listen to Renee DeResta, and I'd love to talk with her a bit later on as well. And I listen to you speak, and I think there's so many people who just won't even hear the attempts to address the problem, because a lot of the narrative framing of it speaks to, I mean, our friend Jordan Hall talks about a blue church framing. So it's so difficult to even communicate in a way that doesn't activate people's immune systems. And yet, as you know, and as I know, Russia has been doing this sort of stuff in Ukraine. They've been doing it in Estonia. This has been part of the Russian tactic. And it's incredibly naive not to assume that they wouldn't do something in 2016. How influential that was and whether there were other reasons for people to vote for Trump is another matter. But there's all this narrative warfare. So I just see so many people when they talk about these problems, often they're also making these sort of signaling moves to other people within kind of the blue church paradigm or the mainstream media paradigm. And people, there's just no communication across these divides. And I just see it sort of cascade down into outrage and rejection of the entire narrative.
Which is ironically a side effect of the polarizing processes of social media, that people have been so reinforced with the tribal dynamic that assumes, because let's say the Mueller report or whatever, there wasn't a connection there with Trump and Russia, as according to those reports. And then that gets hyped up so much that it assumes that anything with the words Russia and social media or the election must all be part of that same blue church sort of signaling, construct. Which is not what I'm suggesting. And I do recommend people, we have a podcast called Your Undivided Attention, where we interview Renee DiResta, who actually she's one of the two teams given full access to Russia's 200 something thousand Facebook and Twitter posts that she examined, and all the memes and everything. And you can actually hear the way that they use Kermit the Frog memes and a whole bunch of other, Simpsons memes, and then switch these accounts over midway through to report on other things. There's a whole library there. I think the important thing to talk about with regard to this topic is to realize that we are in a, full force, unconventional narrative warfare environment. That, while we're sitting here debating notions of free speech and who should have a platform, and oh my God, YouTube shut down my account because I used the word coronavirus, or I used the word Jordan Peterson, and oh my God, they're censoring us. Meanwhile, there are many bad actors who are manipulating the entire thing, and no one's really realizing that, because that also sounds like a conspiracy theory. I think the way to see this is, the challenge of what's happened with social platforms is that they've taken over. They are the new infrastructure. So, our physical world, our world of atoms, with our roads, our telephone lines, et cetera, and our power plants, that's all protected under our national boundaries. If Russia or China tried to fly a plane into the United States, we have, I think it's like we spend $15 billion a day on defense, and the Department of Defense is going to shoot it down and make sure that never happens. So that's protecting the physical infrastructure. But when the digital eats the physical, and you move up a layer from the digital to the virtual, from the physical to the virtual, and Russia are trying to fly a plane into an information plane into Facebook, they're not met by Department of Defense. In fact, the Department of Defense doesn't even know, because only Facebook knows who's trying to fly information planes there. And they actually don't have an incentive to look. And they're, instead of met by a missile defense system, they're met by an algorithm that says, yeah, which zip code or lookalike models or email targeting do you want to target? So in other words, we have a quote unquote defense infrastructure in the digital sphere, which is the opposite of defense. It actually enables the mass manipulation of people at scale. And I really recommend people check out Renee DeRessa's work or our interview with her if they're curious to learn more. But I think this speaks to the fact that people don't even know that this is happening or think of it as some kind of conspiracy theory is itself an enormous problem. And I think that we would do well if the platforms were to implement a policy that whenever a disinformation campaign or what they call coordinated inauthentic behavior is found, that they actually notify people that it actually happened. And that's one of the things that the platforms are not doing, is when they actually take down a network of Chinese pages or Iranian pages or Saudi Arabian pages or Israeli pages, they don't actually back notify everyone who was exposed to those things and let them know that that was actually happening. I think one thing that we're needing here is there's this question of when Russia comes in and let's say they amplify Texas secessionist narratives. Okay, so when they do that, what's the problem here? This is actually a really important point. The Texas secessionist narratives weren't created by Russia. They're actually finding organic Texas secessionists inside, let's say, the United States, and then amplifying them to be louder in a time when there's, like, let's say, more unrest. So where's the problem there? Because it's our own people saying their own things, but the artificial element is the coordination and the level of amplification of it. And then there might be a bunch of people who agree with that Texas secessionists when they actually amplify it at the right time. You say, like, yeah, we should really have Texas just secede from the United States. Or, yeah, we should have Civil War II in these boogaloo groups. And for those who don't know, 64% of the extremist groups that people joined on Facebook's were due to Facebook's own recommendation algorithm, meaning they were actually recommending these groups that people joined. And it actually led recently, in the case of these Boogaloo Boys Civil War II groups, to a federal officer getting murdered by two Boogaloo Boys who had met on Facebook and coordinated the attack. So this is having life and death consequences in the real world. But all that's just to say that, I think we have a massive information war going on. And we don't think of the geopolitical contest between the US and the West and China and Russia as occurring yet. We think of we're in some kind of stalemate or a Cold War, but it's not the case at all. We have no digital borders. While we've been so paranoid about our physical borders and building the wall, we've left the digital borders wide open. And the United States is actually not protecting its infrastructure very well at all.
And I wonder if you have any thoughts about what can be done about this sort of spiral. I'd like to throw in an example that I don't know whether it's so well known in America about the creation of the BBC, because in the 1920s we had these new technologies. We had radio, we had television, and this sort of sense that these were vastly more powerful technologies than the written word. And the BBC was created in the UK as a way, it was sort of at an arm's length from government, sort of renewed every 10 years. To manage these new technologies, because there was a fear that there was a level of coordination that was possible, there was a level of propaganda that was possible with them that hadn't been possible before. And I think you then saw in the 1930s in Germany what could happen if they were used for propaganda. So in a way that was a very far-sighted realization that some kind of organization needed to be created. And I think the BBC kind of worked pretty well up until fairly recently. And I think a lot of people have criticisms of the BBC, like for groupthink, and the commercial pressures on it as well, I think have led to something of a race to the bottom for them as much as for anyone else. But there was at least some sense of there has to be some civic space or some sense of truth that is not subject to corporate pressures. So the BBC still doesn't take advertising. It still has a real reputation around the world. And from the beginning of the COVID crisis, actually the value of the BBC, the amount of trust that people had in the BBC has gone up massively since the beginning of COVID. So it's sort of this sense of once there is a crisis, people do tend to, no matter what they say about kind of the BBC when they're not in a time of crisis, when there is a time of crisis, that's where they go to look for truth. But when I think about some kind of parallel process with social media, the fact that they're corporate actors, the fact that they're subject to those incentive systems, I can't imagine a process that you might be able to go through to create that kind of structure. But it is a similar parallel in a way, a sort of historical analogy at least.
Absolutely. Yeah, we make this metaphor link all the time. And again, I recommend for people Tim Wu's book, The Attention Merchants, which goes through the history of those who were selling attention and the commodity of attention as a product. And the importance of the BBC is saying that there needs to be a kind of civic or social broadcasting space that is guided by the public interest, for the public interest, not for private interests. And I think that's what we've lost, that when the digital ate the physical, what was the digital? When Mark Andreessen's quote, "The software is eating the world." Why did he say that? Software is eating the world. Mark Andreessen was the founder of Netscape. Because the point is that software can do anything that our technology can always add efficiencies that can't be found without the technology. So in general, no matter what domain of life is, whether it's taxis or advertising or energy or Nest, like in your home, you're going to add technology because it's going to add efficiencies that are not going to be there without it, which means that software is going to eat up and gobble up every part of our lives, which means that when the digital will eat the physical, but who's making the digital? The digital was not made by states with public interests, with careful people and wise elders and coming out of Bretton Woods trying to say, what should we, how should we design this to be best for people and do it in the best interests of people? The digital became what a handful of literally like 5 major US-based tech platforms and a couple in China that have ate the physical infrastructure. And that is when that happens, the private interests eat the public interests, and that's the problem. So the question is, how do you get back to a publicly interested kind of BBC public broadcasting type model, but more of a public social media? What does public interest social media look like? And that's close to some of the work that we're doing at the Center for Humane Technology, is trying to move ourselves off of these bad incentives. The other problem here is just the problem of runaway, predatory capitalism growth, where if you think of why we're so stuck with these private corporations who lead to these harms, in the same way that in regular predatory capitalism, if a whale is worth more dead than alive, and a tree is worth more as a dead slab of lumber than it is as a tree, we're gonna be more profitable to take every tree and turn it into lumber, and take every whale and turn it into a dead whale. In the attention capitalism model, it's going to be more profitable for a person to be addicted, outraged, polarized, and disinformed than if they're just a human being or a citizen of a society. Because I think of, we talked about consciousness as we were starting this interview, and the link between consciousness and attention. And I think of the way that these platforms harvest attention as almost like the dead lumber, these dead slabs of attention, of consciousness that we're mining and commodifying into sort of passivity, addiction, loneliness. We haven't talked about the many other social harms that are emerging here, the harms of teenagers, teenage girls, the rising of teen suicides and depression and isolation, because of the way that we've hooked up an entire generation to variable social approval and reinforcement, where your identity is reinforced when you look different than you actually do. People only like you if you only looked a little bit different than you actually do. There's all of these side effects that come from this privatization of human attention as a commodity, as opposed to as something sacred. And so much like if you know Michael Sandel's work on the moral limits of markets and I think the book is called What Money Can't Buy, The Moral Limits of Markets, that we have become a market society. We've let markets actually intrude into every aspect of our lives instead of asking, where is the boundary? What is public space? What is the national park that we don't say is for drilling? What are the parts of the ocean that we don't say are for dead whales? What are the parts of the forests in the Amazon that we need for, being the effective carbon basins for climate change that we don't want to just leave to deforestation and harvesting for lumber? And that's kind of the bigger question here, is that when the digital eats the physical, we have private interests, runaway private interests, eat the public interest. Now, that's not saying let's dismantle all of capitalism. That's just saying, where is the boundary between, making sure we have a sustainable, non-self-terminating civilization? And I think those questions are far more important than, hey, did YouTube flag my video and maybe that one video got demonetized? Like, we're talking about whether the collective psyche can make sense of the world in an accurate way and find consensus-based decision-making mechanisms, like at a very fast timescale in the case of some of the problems that we're facing.